have some Lord of the Rings fans in the crowd, so I'm just going to start paraphrasing there. It's a phrase from the first book, and it says the world has changed. We feel it in the air. We feel it in the water. And I feel like that's very much a sentiment that we're seeing today in terms of the landscape that a lot of organizations are having to deal with when it comes to people, when it comes to stakeholders, as part of this S of the ESG concept, right? So as part of that, you see concepts coming out like stakeholder capitalism. That's just proof of the conversations that we're having right now, where stakeholder engagement is leading the way in terms of a lot of ESG agenda topics.
I couldn't agree more. Our stakeholder groups, very similar, right? Customers are both commercial and consumers, and so I'll talk about that difference in a minute. Regulators is another that Nancy, you didn't mention, that I wanted to highlight. And it's not just one group of regulators, right? It might be a privacy regulator, a trade regulator. There are a lot of different overlapping groups here. So even in that community, very diverse, especially when you're talking about a global set of regulations. I liken this to building a car while you're careening down the freeway, right? Because this is such an evolving area that we're trying to set our priorities, figure out what we're going to do to comply, and the regulations are being developed and ever-changing. So that's a really complex environment, especially for a large multinational corporation, right? I think sometimes there's not an appreciation for how long it takes to change the direction of a ship, right? It's not something you can do overnight, so often you have to be thinking several steps ahead, even when you don't know exactly what the landscape's going to look like. So that's a complexity.
So just to add, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, we went through, again, a materiality assessment in 2019, but we just updated it because what we know is that these issues are not static, and that we often need to have a refresher to understand what are those stakeholders caring about today versus what it was pre-pandemic. And so as we've gone through that work, we understand now that some of the things that were not a high priority previously have bubbled up to the more significant issues that our stakeholders care about. So for example, ethics was not a high priority pre-pandemic. It was on the list, but not a high priority. Now it's a material priority, mainly because folks want to know that you are doing what you say. There's a question that pops up quite a bit about greenwashing because a lot of folks are issuing these reports. Is there a substantiation and validation for what it is that you're putting out? Or are you just making these statements that are, quite frankly, are meaningless in the way that you move your business? And so it's been helpful for us to kind of recalibrate to make sure that we are staying close to the expectations of our consumers, the expectations of our employees and our investors. So as we begin to move past this round of CSR reporting, we are moving and focusing on some of these heightened issues. But we set our program up. We created a pillar that said, okay, we have people, product, and planet, because we are a product-driven business. And so underneath there are some priorities that we leverage to attach to our business, because we want to make sure that we're providing value through this work. And one of the challenges that I had early on in getting the role around CSR and ESG was, what's the benefit to the organization?
As I'm just listening to our conversation, I'm thinking that ESG does a great job of breaking down silos. So when it's Tony and Aaron and Yadira, your questions and your comments, we're just talking about this, especially during COVID. I think it created an environment where silos could kind of resurface or could happen again more organically. We have to be really intentional about addressing those. And ESG, it gives you this opportunity, this invitation to bring together a lot of people to talk about business strategy and ESG, which aren't always exactly the same, but there's a lot of overlap. And to have conversations, when Tony was speaking about Myanmar, I was just thinking, you're more prepared often to address those issues. If you've been getting together and discussing ESG issues, you have your teams ready. You've been talking about risk. And it helps to prepare a lot of the tough conversations because you now see things through more lenses. And I really see how that has helped us at Western Union.
I'll jump in on the communication part. This is something I had wanted to say earlier and didn't come up, but I think the key is storytelling there, and I think that's been a theme here this week, but anchoring metrics or particular progress against goals with a story of how it impacts, and that brings it to life, I think, and lets it sort of go beyond your report, right? Then I think you can use that as a jumping off point. So I think how you tell the story and anchoring it not only in metrics and data, but then how does it impact the communities you're in? How has it been brought to life, or what impact did it have? That's something on communication that I think is really key beyond the report, because you're right. The data is, voluminous, right? And you have to really be selective about what you communicate. And so we think of that, as we call them the hero stories, that align with each part of the goal. It's like, how are you going to spotlight this time, right? And then use that as a way to bring it to life.
Both great questions. And I would say at Western Union, it's a very cross-functional effort to create our ESG strategy in the report. So we have an ESG function per se, and then I'm in the legal department, so I'm on this cross-functional ESG team, and I'm providing guidance from a regulatory, legal perspective. It's critical to have our DEI function, which is in our people services organization. I mean, you have risk, you have all these different groups that contribute to this, but there's so many different ways, I think, that companies can set up an ESG function. I think the most important thing is that you have a really cross-functional team. We haven't talked a lot about governance, which wasn't as much the focus, but it almost takes us there, because when you think about the cross-functional team, then that leads up to the executive team. Maybe you have a steering committee, for example. We do at Western Union, and then we have one of the committees on our board that actually has ESG in their name. So it's corporate governance, public policy, and the ESG committee. On communication, one thing we are thinking about, aspiring to, and looking at what other companies are doing is exactly what Tony and Aaron were speaking about as far as making it digestible and easy to find, because our report is also fairly long. And we thought about, is there a way to have like a one-pager, like a fact sheet? Or, I mean, I spend a lot of time going to other companies and checking out what they're doing on ESG and how easy it is to find data, to Aaron's point, and metrics, because it really is a marrying of those two things, and making that accessible, also to go back to the raters and rankers, to make it easy for people to find the good information that you have and to put it forward, and for it to be accurate, that they can quickly find accurate information. So the communication question is a fantastic one.